thank you everyone for joining us for another webinar in the Freshwater Stewardship Community Series. We're very excited to have Lamisa with us today, and she's going to be our keynote presenter. Two other people that are going to be with you today are myself. So I'm Monica, I'm the Communications and Fundraising Manager at Watersheds Canada. And someone else from Watersheds Canada who will be in the chat is Nicole, who is our environmental technician, and she will be able to help anyone if you're having technological problems or if you have any questions, you can send her a private message and she will be able to help you out. So if anyone on the call is not familiar with Watersheds Canada, we are a national nonprofit and charitable organization based in Perth, Ontario. And we deliver programs across the country in partnership with landowners, community groups, and students who are looking to take action to protect their fresh water. On the screen, you can see a couple of our different programs. So we work with landowners to naturalize their property using native plants. So that's our Natural Edge program, which you can see in the top left. We have a program delivered in partnership with the Canadian Wildlife Federation, which is called Love Your Lake. And that is a shoreline assessment evaluation program where we fill out a protocol sheet for each property on a lake, and they are able to get custom recommendations that are voluntary for their property that can help protect the health of the lake. So you can see that photo in the bottom left. And then the one on our right was from our recent fish habitat restoration program, where we were restoring a trout spawning bed by putting out new rock on top of the ice, which will then fall into the water in the spring and restore the bed. So if you have any questions about any of these types of programs, please feel free to either drop them in the chat or you can send us an email. Specifically, you are all here today because of the Freshwater Stewardship Community, which is an online community that is connecting people from across the country. So over 1,200 members are already a part of this community. It has been going on for over a year now, and all of the webinars and handouts that have gone with those webinars are archived on our website, which is watersheds.ca/freshwater-stewardship. And so I encourage you to check that out after today. There are things from the private sector, from other nonprofits, from academia, things targeted specifically for families, and they cover a wide range of topics, all related to freshwater health and getting out into nature. And we would like to also thank the Peterborough K.M. Hunter Foundation and S.M. Blair Family Foundation for their generous funding for the freshwater stewardship community. Before we get into today's session, I just want to let everyone know that we do have another presentation coming up on Friday, April 1st at 11 a.m. And Nicole is going to drop the registration link in the chat. So if you are interested in learning about how fish and aquatic invertebrates can affect the quality of the water around them and how they may contribute to fertilization, you can register for that presentation, again, taking place on Friday, April 1st at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. And as with all of our presentations, if you are not able to attend them live, I encourage you still to sign up so that you can receive the recording and resources to your mailbox, and you can view that on demand. But for today, we are going to introduce our speaker. So Lamisa is a PhD candidate at the Department of Civil and Environment Engineering at the University of Waterloo. She has 7 years of academic research experience in the field of water and environmental sector. Her PhD research focuses on studying the impact of past and present nutrient use on water quality. So I will pass it over to you, Lamisa.
Thank you, Monica. Let me share my screen. You can see the screen shared, right?
Yes, you're good to go.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, thank you, Watershed Canada, and thank you everyone for coming here and giving me an exciting opportunity to share my research with all of you. I would like to start by acknowledging my funding organization and my supervisor, Nandita Basu. Today, I'm going to talk about algal bloom, water quality, and how past human activities have altered the phosphorus cycle and how it's affecting the present water quality. So I will start my presentation with these mandatory green slides. So this picture was taken in Lake Erie Reservoir, showing a boat cutting through toxic algal bloom. Many of you might have seen this foul-smelling and sometimes toxic algal bloom, and these blooms are becoming more common in river, lakes, ponds, and reservoirs nowadays. So what is algae? Algae are organisms that derive energy from sun and nutrients. And algal bloom is a term used to indicate the overgrowth of algae. Now, we see a dead fish on the shore of the Lake Erie. It's covered with a green wave of algae. These excessive growth of algae can cause oxygen depletion within the lake, which can lead to death of fishes and harm marine lives. Here, we see some example of water pulled from Lake Erie near Toledo, Ohio in 2014. In 2040, a major toxic bloom overwhelmed the lake. It led to beach closure and issuing a no-drink advisory for tap water. It affected 400,000 people for 3 days and sickened more than hundreds. Well, these are only some consequences of harmful algal bloom in Lake Erie, but it is a threat to North America. And algae has been all over the North American news with this nuisance for past decades. They are linked to beach closure, drinking water advisory, death of pets, dogs, threat to marine life and ecosystem. Most importantly, cost to mitigate the damage by harmful algal bloom. Estimates suggest that US alone spends more than $1 billion annually as a result of algal bloom damage. Now, when we look for articles outside the North America, the algal bloom is prevalent all over the world. Let's look at this world map. So if you look at the map, you will notice the dots indicate the algal bloom prone areas, and you will notice it's all over the world, particularly in the areas that is heavily influenced by human activity, such as Washington, Mississippi River Basin in US, Lake Victoria in Africa, Baltic Sea in Europe, Yangtze River in China, and rivers in India. Now, the question comes, what is causing this algal bloom? So one line of answer is, algal bloom occurs if suitable environmental conditions exist. Suitable environmental conditions for algal bloom are like warmer temperature, abundant light, stable wind condition, and high nutrient in water, especially nitrogen and phosphorus. Late summer and early fall is generally the time when we see algae grow, and it's the time when the environmental conditions is favorable for these algae. And you will notice the most blooms are often reported during that summertime. Another important driver for the blooms is the supply of excess nutrients. Use of excessive fertilizer during farming, waste due to industrialization and urbanization, phosphorus content detergent use causes this nutrient runoff in lake, and microorganisms use this excess nutrient in favorable environmental condition and cause algal bloom. It is also important to acknowledge the effect of climate change. So global warming is leading warmer and longer summer. Warmer water is easier for small organisms to move through and allow algae to float to the surface faster. So algal bloom near the surface then absorb more light, making the water even warmer and promoting more bloom. Climate change also affects the rainfall patterns, thus it's leading to alternative periods of drought and intense storm. This intense storm causes more nutrient runoff into the water bodies and it feeds more algal bloom. So in short, excess nitrogen and phosphorus in water body under favorable environmental condition will induce this algae growth. But have you ever thought why phosphorus is so important for the growth of algae? So I will show you an interesting example, which was done in an experimental lake on Ontario. So bit of background on this, like in early 1970, United States started banning phosphorus in detergent. They found that detergent phosphorus do not biodegrade and it builds up as phosphate in water supplies. Of course, detergent companies were not happy about that. And they claimed that carbon was the limiting agent causing nutrient enrichment, not the phosphorus. So an enthusiastic scientist, Dr. Schindler, decided to conduct this experiment to study the impact of phosphorus on algal bloom. So he split the lake in half with a curtain and he fertilized one side of the basin with carbon and nitrogen while the other side with phosphorus. The phosphorus, carbon, and nitrogen. So the side that had phosphorus in it led to develop algal bloom, while the other side without phosphorus did not. Thus, this experiment, they agreed to that the phosphorus is a crucial element for this algae growth, and eventually authorities decided to upgrade the phosphorus removal efficiency from the wastewater treatment plant. So this experiment is an indicator that we really need to think about our managing phosphorus input into the water to mitigate this algal bloom problem. So now comes to the question, what are the sources of phosphorus and how these phosphorus gets into the water from the land? Well, the primary cause of phosphorus pollution are runoff from agricultural field and urban sources. Agricultural runoff is induced due to the excessive use of fertilizer and unmanaged manure, where urban sources include wastewater treatment plant like household waste like septic system and laundry detergent use. Phosphorus from these sources reach to the river and lakes via surface and subsurface pathways and it causes algal bloom. An over application of this mineral and fertilizer and manure in agricultural soil have resulted in a build-up of soil phosphorus pool. These building up of phosphorus in landscape is known as legacy phosphorus. In this slide, I'm going to walk you through the ideas of legacy phosphorus in the landscape and how we use this approach to calculate excess phosphorus in our watershed. So here is the watershed in green, and the lake that receives the runoff from the watershed is represented in blue. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, that phosphorus from fertilizer, manure, and domestic wastes are major phosphorus input to the landscape. The input here is represented in orange square in the landscape. And I tried to make the box approximately to the scale so the depth of the orange box represents the amount of phosphorus received by land from input sources. Then crop takes up phosphorus from the land, which helps them to grow. So the crop uptake is the phosphorus outflow from the landscape, and it's represented as in the gray box. Then the leftover phosphorus input stays in the land, and we call it as excess phosphorus, or we term as phosphorus surplus. These phosphorus surplus can eventually be exported via direct runoff, and sometimes it can accumulate in the landscape. This accumulated phosphorus is referred as legacy phosphorus, and it can further reach into the lakes and rivers via surface and subsurface export. And also, slow release from the legacy pool can cause water pollution decades after phosphorus application have ceased. So one simple way to understand legacy is by comparing it losing weight. So if you start going on a diet today, you will limit food intake, but you will not likely lose weight tomorrow. It takes some time to see the effect of your diet and lose your weight. So the idea of legacy phosphorus is very similar to that. So if you reduce phosphorus load today, it will take some time for water quality to be improved. For example, let's consider an intensively managed catchment and assume that it has legacy phosphorus stored due to decades of intensive agricultural activity. In this image, legacy phosphorus is stored as an internal memory within the landscape. Let's say we adopted a strategy to reduce phosphorus loading by changing land use practices. The load reduction strategies could be strategies like banning phosphorus from detergent, upgrading wastewater treatment plant, or implementation of forward nutrient stewardship strategies, anything. And then we want the load to be near the background level. But there is an internal memory within the landscape that needs to be depleted to notice water quality to improve and get back to the background level. So there is a time delay between implementation of load reduction strategy and achieving background load goal. This delay time is called lag time or recovery time. Due to this lag in response, legacy phosphorus stored in landscape may take several days to decades to travel before it reaches the stream and show an increase in stream phosphorus concentration. Like if the phosphorus stored within the surface soil layer are say flowing through an artificial tile drain system, it may take minutes to hours to reach into the stream. On the other hand, like if it's stored in soil layer, it may take months to years to reach to the stream, or it can reach into further groundwater, which can lead to lag times as high as several decades. So now we know that there is a legacy phosphorus accumulated in our landscape. What are the indicators that legacy is contributing to lake water quality? How will we know how much legacy has been accumulated, and when and how will it impact the water quality in future? And most importantly, what can we do to estimate it? To answer this, I will move back to the Lake Erie Basin again. So Lake Erie is most pronounced among the Great Lakes due to recurring algal bloom problems since 1960. The Lake Erie was so polluted back then that it started to get mentioned even in pop culture. The first edition of famous children's book, Lorax in 1971, talk about the Lake Erie water pollution, and it shows that the fishes were leaving in search of some water that it isn't so smeary. But by the mid-1980s, the lake had vastly improved due to intensive anti-pollution efforts, and eventually that pursued Dr. Sigos to remove the name of Lake Erie from her next edition of the book. So what happened in the Lake Erie Basin between this 1971 to 1986 period? So it started with the Great Lake Water Quality Agreement in 1972. The detergent phosphorus was banned, and major project was undertaken at that time to upgrade the wastewater treatment plant. As a result, we saw a dramatic decline of total phosphorus input. The figure, in this figure, the bar represents the annual phosphorus load, and each region Great Lake water quality agreement target loading level of 11,000 metric ton annually during 1980. As a result, no algal bloom was reported between 1980 to 1990. However, in 1993, first hypoxia was again reported in Lake Erie, and by 2000, the algal bloom had returned in Lake Erie. So to mitigate this recurring problem, in 2007, the Ohio Phosphorus Task Force recommended a 40% reduction in phosphorus loading and adopt strategies to reduce phosphorus load by 2025. But after all these measures, this algal bloom problem and nutrient enrichment is persistent in Lake Erie. And if you look at the figure at right, the severe algal bloom appeared in the year 2011, 13, 15, 2017, and even in 2019. This raises question about our ability to set realistic water quality targets with conventional management plans that did not account for phosphorus legacies. So that was my motivation for the research project, and I spent quite a bit of time developing phosphorus budget for Lake Erie to calculate this excess phosphorus and legacy phosphorus accumulation. So surplus calculation needs a lot of data that goes way back to the past so that we can estimate the effect of phosphorus on past land use practices. So I developed 86 years of mass balance study for counties in Lake Erie Basin. So let's focus on the figure at left first. Phosphorus surplus started to increase mostly after 1940 due to the increase of synthetic fertilizer. The yellow bar in the figure shows the fertilizer phosphorus. It's clearly visible that fertilizer is the major phosphorus input to the Lake Erie Basin. Then annual phosphorus surplus peaked in between 1970s to late 80, and it presented in a black, white, bold line. But after implementation of nutrient abatement program to ban phosphorus in detergent, and increase of crop yield with better technology led to decline in phosphorus surplus after late 1980s. But at present, the significant number of counties exhibit negative surplus. So if you look at the map at the right, there are gray areas. So these gray areas represent negative surplus. That indicates these areas are phosphorus deficit area. It means more phosphorus is taken up by the plant crop than its input. And these are the location that has like high crop production rates. So despite the fact that phosphorus is deficit in most areas and surplus is decreasing across the basin, recurring algal bloom is still a common occurrence. So it indicates that the present algal bloom is not only a result of current phosphorus surplus. And next step, we added phosphorus surplus from 1930 to 2060 to quantify the magnitude of accumulated phosphorus between this year. And we see the accumulation across the watershed. The warmer the color indicates more accumulation. High accumulation were observed in southern Ontario. Then we correspond this with the spatial distribution of input, and we observe that high manure input areas correspond to the high legacy accumulation. So in next step, to understand the effect of manure and fertilizer in phosphorus pollution, we couple phosphorus surplus and in-stream phosphorus concentration. First, we see Maumee River watershed in Ohio. which is a heavily agricultural watershed, and more than 70% of land used for agriculture. And our phosphorus budget also found that greater than 50% of phosphorus input is coming from phosphorus fertilizer use application. Due to the load conservation effort, we see the phosphorus surplus in blue-gray areas has reduced significantly over the year. In fact, after 2002, annual phosphorus surplus of the watershed is below zero, which indicate that these areas are phosphorus deficit and it's no longer accumulating legacy phosphorus after 2002. However, when we plotted annual total phosphorus concentration, we see that total phosphorus concentration has not been improved as it should have been after reduction of phosphorus surplus. So now the question is, where is this total phosphorus coming from in the stream? Well, this could be due to legacy effect. The legacy phosphorus that have been accumulated in the soil over several decades of intensive and unplanned fertilizer use is still exporting into the river and causing increase of total phosphorus concentration. So let's look at another example. It's a Grand River watershed in Ontario, and it's a large watershed includes the city like Waterloo, Cambridge, and Brantford. And our mass balance shows more than 50% of the total phosphorus input is from livestock manure. This watershed shows the increase of phosphorus surplus in recent years. But when we compare that with total phosphorus concentration, we see a decreasing trend of total phosphorus. So one potential cause can be that the fact this is a potentially lagged watershed and it's still accumulating total phosphorus, which is yet to be released under some favorable conditions. This is a work from my colleague. So my colleague worked on legacy phosphorus stored in Grand River watershed. She developed a model that simulates phosphorus dynamics to estimate legacy phosphorus storage in different land compartments. She showed that legacy phosphorus can accumulate in soil riparian zones, landfill, and groundwater. The model results showed more than 500 kilotons of phosphorus has been stored in our landscape in Grand River watershed since 1900. And approximately 90% of total phosphorus accumulation is accumulated in soil pool. And if you see the orange area indicate the huge phosphorus accumulation in soil. Whereas very little, less than 1% of total legacy phosphorus is accumulated in groundwater. The model also helps us to able to quantify the lag time within the watershed, and it will help in identify whether the 40% reduction target is feasible in Lake Erie watershed or not. I will show you 3 scenarios from her work. The first is business as usual practice, meaning that there are no changes in current management practices. By no change, I mean if we continue to move forward with current P surplus trajectories, we will not only make no progress towards the phosphorus reduction goal, but actually we will end up with an approximately 12% increase of phosphorus loading by the year 2045. This scenario tells us the importance of considering legacy when we are to set up a water quality goal. In next scenario, it was assumed that 95% of phosphorus input to agricultural land are utilized by crop production and livestock consumption. Theoretically, these level of efficiency could be achieved through improved nutrient management practices like lowering fertilizer application rate and using cover crop that can extract this excess phosphorus from agricultural soil. Anyway, even with this scenario, we see and approximately like a 2% of increase in comparison with the current phosphorus load. But in third scenario, she eliminated all manure handling loss addition to the 95% of phosphorus input uptaken by crop. With this model, it's estimated that 26% of decrease in phosphorus load by 2045. These results suggest that management of manure housing and storage losses may be one of the most powerful tools available to achieve substantial reduction in phosphorus loading in downstream water, especially in some of the Great Lakes regions. However, even with this substantial amount of phosphorus input reduction, the model shows that that additional measures would be necessary to meet the current 40% reduction goal that has been set for many of the Lake Erie watershed. So now let's look at some large-scale studies about legacy phosphorus. So US Geological Survey, USGS compared phosphorus budget with river phosphorus export for 143 watershed across the US, and it shows that most of the watershed across the America are above the eutrophic threshold. The interesting thing is that they noticed that 1/3 of the watershed received phosphorus from the legacy pool. So the shades of pink are the watersheds that contribute from the legacy source set. The darker the pink, higher the contribution from legacy pools. Another US scale study shows the surplus of phosphorus is all over the US, mostly on the eastern side of the US where agricultural activity is high. And we see in the bottom plot, the warmer color, a lot of legacy phosphorus has been accumulated near agricultural region of Chesapeake Bay watershed and eastern North Carolina. This is another work done by Van Staden, and she showed is up to 850 kg per hectare of phosphorus accumulated in a landscape of Ontario over 55 years. Higher magnitude is observed near the southern Ontario due to high density of agricultural land. Northern Ontario watersheds are minimally impacted, and the watersheds that are like areas in yellow and blue is like represent zero or negative surplus, and these are mostly areas with no agricultural activity. This slide is a kind of a glimpse of our ongoing phosphorus work by Basu Lab. We are collecting long-term historical data, mostly from agricultural database of USA and Canada. Left is our ongoing Canada work, and right one is US, and we see maps of livestock and fertilizer input. The darker the color, more phosphorus input to the area. Like for crop uptake, darker green represent more phosphorus is uptaken by the crops. So if you look at the Canada, we see there are hotspots are mostly area where human interruptions are higher, like Southern Ontario, Montreal, Winnipeg, Calgary. But in US scale study shows that large, like high phosphorus input in mid-eastern US region, Midwestern US agricultural region. So we have spatial distribution of historical phosphorus input and output across the North America. The next step, we will calculate phosphorus surplus using these data set to determine historical phosphorus surplus, and eventually we will estimate legacy phosphorus from that. So now that we see evidence that there are legacy phosphorus stored in our landscape, what can be some potential ways to manage them? First step to manage legacy are to quantify timelines. This is a task we researchers are doing, developing mass balance and model that help us to estimate the timeline. There are many models that consider complex biogeochemical process and field data out there. Combining these can help us to estimate time lags better, but there are uncertainties in model because it's a very difficult and it's difficult to understand the complex hydrogeochemical process that drives this delayed time. So yet this model may not be accurate, but we can get an estimation about the time range of the delayed time. That it's not impossible to adjust our expectation regarding the time frame of achieving water quality goal. The next step is very important, is to use these legacies as resources by adjusting our fertilizer application. We can lower the fertilizer application rate where legacies are known to have accumulated and the soil phosphorus is high. Most cases, when soil phosphorus is high, lower fertilizer application rates may not lead to notable declines in crop yield. In fact, several studies have successfully showed that the lowering fertilizer application rate did not impact crop yield in lands with a high legacy stores. We can then effectively use this legacy store. It will cut up our fertilizer application costs, lower phosphorus fluxes to stream without sacrificing our crop yield. However, crop yields would vary spatially as a function of soil and crop type, topography, and climate drivers. So in a word, it will depend on how much legacy phosphorus can be taken up by the crop under given surrounding condition. For that, technological innovations required to estimate the soil phosphorus demand at the field scale that will help us to target the fertilizer application. That's been said that the adoption to this new approach will require some societal change, and we need to come out of the conventional belief that we can't get better crop yield without fertilizer. Yes, this has to be deal with some risks associated with it, that these might require some incentive structures to protect farmer against the crop yield loss from lowering fertilizer application rate, as well as some regulatory approach to penalize for over application of fertilizer and manure in the field. Then, and next we need to apply targeted strategies based on location and land use. We often seem to advocate on conservation practices without thinking about the differences in agricultural practices or legacy related risk. To get the best outcome from any regulatory measures, we need to adopt target-based strategies that is different based on location and land use. For example, if a cropland dominated agricultural region has like a large legacy accumulation, incentives can be taken to reduce fertilizer application. Whereas if a region has like a high density of livestock and poultry farm, regulatory measures can be taken to manage manure and reduce runoff from animal waste. Addition to these, like geographical variability, like soil and groundwater condition can be different. So one strategies may not fit everywhere. A management strategy in an area with a large lag time may not lead to immediate benefit, while the same strategy, if it's applied to an area with a short lifetime, may lead to faster benefit. Again, the strategies to access phosphorus legacies that accumulated in upper layer of soil should be different from the one that are in deep layer of soil or in the ground layer. That's being said, deep soil or that means say different strategies, either it could be field scale or downstream measures are required to access different pool of legacy. Say, reducing fertilizer application resulted the crop accessing soil phosphorus legacies. but it doesn't address the groundwater legacies or particular form of phosphorus that can be eroded from surface in case of extreme events. More downstream control is required to access the phosphorus from runoff of the soil or the groundwater legacies. Examples of some downstream controls are establishing wetlands, reservoir, riparian buffer, which can essentially filter the phosphorus from the water. An example of field scale measures are cover crops and on-site some nutrient management. These address the source of the problem in the soil root zone, but the benefits sometimes may take longer to realize due to the legacies, particularly if they are stored in deeper layers. So the strategic combination of watershed conservation measures that address both soil and groundwater legacies can lead to faster watershed response. Lastly, before taking nationwide decision and setting up policies, economic analysis and cost-benefit analysis must be account for legacies and must account phosphorus legacies and time lags. We have to learn from our past researches and studies and nutrient management strategies set out at the past that even with the adoption of very aggressive management practices, we will be haunted by legacies, and it can take decades to improve our water quality. With that, I would like to end my presentation, and thank you so much for listening to me, and I will open the floor for any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We do have some questions, and maybe I'll actually get you to go back to sharing your presentation because I think some of these questions are for specific slides.
Sure.
So I'll just wait for you to get that up and then we can go into the questions.
Yeah.
So the first one was around slide 17. So it's asking if you could define what total phosphorus is, TP, and if the sample filtered is through an 80 micron filter as the Ministry of the Environment does, or if it includes both particulate and dissolved phosphorus species.
So yeah, TP includes both dissolved and particular phosphorus species, and even the sample are taken from the provincial water quality monitoring station data. So we do not take samples, so we take data from the national database. So the data is obtained from the national database, and yes, it is from their standard measuring technique. And it includes total phosphorus, include the particulate and soluble phosphorus.
Perfect. The next one was on slide 19 or so. And I was just asking who is doing this kind of mapping. Oh, maybe it was the previous slide then. Who is doing this kind of mapping in Canada? The person had asked the Federal Office on Climate Change, but they had no answer. So they're just wondering who's tracking algae blooms in Canada.
So for algae bloom in Canada, there is not like a specific tracking like US does, is like vigorously, but for Canada, most algae bloom is like in near the southern side of Canada, near like Ontario, and mostly in Lake Erie region. So this map is actually not showing any algae bloom. These are data-driven and watershed studies that compared the surplus phosphorus with the a phosphorus export into the watershed. And it's a kind of also for Canada, we are trying to do similar work like the US, but it's a very beginning, our project in a very like a new stage. So we have developing the surplus, but yet we plan to do some further analysis similar to that, compare with the surplus with the export similar to what is there for US.
Great. The next question is from someone who has seen that the proportion of soluble phosphorus has increased and that it's having an impact on algae growth in Lake Erie since there's more bioavailable phosphorus. So can you speak to that factor in addition to legacy phosphorus?
Yeah, so there are a lot of internal processes going on, and it is true that there has been, especially near the western side of Lake Erie, it has been seen the soluble reactive or like the bioavailable phosphorus has been increased. It may be due to the some internal processes, maybe it could be due to the tillage conservation measures. Yeah, there could be a lot of internal processes that causing to increase the soluble phosphorus, but there has to be we don't know exactly for what is driving that, but it's aggregated due to some conservation practices. So it's something that must be that's separate from particular to soluble phosphorus in those agricultural watersheds. Yeah.
Great. Someone is asking how you define an algal bloom.
How do I find it's an algal bloom?
Mm-hmm.
So algal bloom is cyanobacteria bloom. So sometimes biologists measure the chlorophyll density in the water to confirm that it's algal bloom. And most, if it's the algal bloom is severe, you probably could have seen by looking at the lake water if it's like greenish scum all over the place. So it's probably those cyanobacteria or different kind of algal bloom is there. But not algal bloom are harmful. Particular type of algal bloom that's called a blue-green algae, those sometimes can be toxic and that can harm people, and not people or like animals or other marine life.
Okay, and then specifically about your model, does it take into account sequestered phosphorus that's take account of sequestered phosphorus resuspension with a warming climate?
No. So my model and the model that we are developing that's a watershed model that do not account for the phosphorus processes that's going on in between the lake. So we only simulate phosphorus dynamics that within the land. So it's not dealing with what's phosphorus processes that's going on with the lake inside the lake.
Okay. Are you aware of any government fines that would fine a landowner adjacent to an evidence source of nutrients for an algal bloom?
Can you repeat that question again?
Sure. Are you aware of any government fines for landowners who are adjacent to the evidence source of nutrients for an algal bloom?
So I don't know. I haven't found anything. I don't know about that thing actually. Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah. So that's not yeah. So I haven't gone through any of the studies. So it could be there are. So this supposed to be if you're living near the landowner's land is near the Lake Erie region, they might have. Yeah.
The next question is, how much of a factor is legacy phosphorus in sediments?
Yeah, so legacy phosphorus do store in sediment, and it's a very big pool of legacy phosphorus within the lake. so not the land. So our studies is done, that's legacy phosphorus that is within the watershed. So we hydrologists, we deal with the land phosphorus, and there are complete different sectors that deal with the phosphorus, that legacy phosphorus that is within the lake and sediment. But yeah, there's like a large pool, like a huge legacy accumulated in the lake sediment.
Great. And I've just put in the chat a short evaluation survey. So if people are able to just let us know how today went, if it was what you expected, and also if you have any topics or speakers that you would like to see in the webinar series for the rest of the year, that would be the place to tell us. And also, I think we have caught up with all of the questions in the chat because some people are helping answer the questions for you.
Oh, thank you so much.
So I'll just maybe wait one more minute if people have any other questions. And in the meantime, I will share our handout that we've created to accompany Lamisa's presentation. So it covers some of the main points as well as some additional readings and education resources. So we will be sending this out to everyone along with the recording from today's event later on this week. So you will be able to watch that on demand, or if you want to post either the recording or this handout somewhere like a social media page or on a Lake Association site, you are more than welcome to do so. And also in that email, we will give you Lamisa's email. So if you have any further questions for her that you think of later on, you'll be able to contact her directly.
Monica?
Yes.
Yes, Bob Reynolds from Lake Bernard Property Owners. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Just it's probably something that people hear a lot, but we have naysayers. They say, yeah, we had a bloom twice, but it'll go away. It won't come back. And I'd like to hear Lamisa give a reading on this, that if you don't do anything, it'll go away, as opposed to you must do something, especially with climate change. I'd like to have her comments, please.
So algae bloom is, you will say, it's a natural process. So if you have nutrients in the water, it will grow, and with the terms like if you, when you are getting a colder weather, it will die out eventually. So yeah, it will go away by its own, and it can sometimes be nasty to see algae in your water near your home, but it's not always harmful for you, because some type of algae can be harmful. But if you are asking in terms of like what is the relationship with it in terms of climate change, it's like climate change can have two effects. One is the warmer temperature, and another is like particularly storm event. It can increase the intensity of algae bloom because of the warm temperature, and it sometimes you can have prolonged algae bloom if you are having a longer and warmer summer. But yeah, so you can do something. Of course, a little bit of like effort from everyone is helpful and required to mitigate this huge problem. But yeah, what you can do, you can conserve fertilizer use, you can restrict like a phosphorus runoff there, but it's a kind of a bigger issue that everybody needs to come up with, and it needs a lot of effort from all together.
Okay, and there are a couple more questions in the chat, so we'll go through those ones.
Yeah, of course.
Someone is asking if there are any cover crop species that preferably target phosphorus in deeper soil layers so that they could get out some of that legacy phosphorus.
So there are, this is not my expertise actually, but I have read and heard like there are some type of cover crop that can address the legacy more better, especially the rotation of cover crop like rapeseed and wheat. Sometimes these rotation can help to take up better legacy phosphorus from the soil. But yeah, so these can, I don't know what's the depth they can access phosphorus, but these type of rotational of crop in particularly non-growing cereals are sometimes is helping to take up those legacy phosphorus that is in the soil.
Okay, and I'm also going to put our Natural Edge program's email in the chat. I suspect if they don't already have some examples from the site visits that they do with native plants, we would be able to do that research and figure that out. So if anyone has any specific questions about their own property, they can reach out to our Natural Edge program. So someone, I guess, to kind of build on Bob's question was what type of advocacy would make the most impact to reduce algae blooms?
For now, I would say controlling fertilizer and restrict our manure laws could be the most effective way to reduce phosphorus that eventually leads to reduction of algae bloom. But as you know, this legacy, if the legacy storage is high, it might take a lot of time. So you should not expect to expect like instant effect of this reduction strategy and instantly see water quality improvement.
Okay, and then a question about an area up kind of where watersheds is based. So Lanark and Renfrew farmers appear to be intensifying land use by stripping out the field buffers that would retain phosphorus. So do you know of any movements that would reduce that practice or ways that people could, advocate for keeping those field buffers?
I don't know any movement on those things, but yeah, that's definitely shouldn't have been done because it will retain more phosphorus. But thank you so much for the question, but it's definitely a thing that further the policymaker or like someone should look into that so that we do not strip out those field buffer in the state.
And I think if people want to reach out for that specific region, the Muskrat Watershed Council would be a good place to go. We've worked with them in the past for our Natural Edge program, restoring agricultural sites. So they might have some resources available for that specific area. And I think that is everything in the chat. So again, everyone, you'll get the recording for today's session, the handout, and Lamisa's email if you think of any questions afterwards. And we would just like to thank you, Lamisa, so much for your time today and explaining this complicated issue.
Monica?
Yes.
Jerry here. I'm on the Muskrat Watershed Council, and we have been encouraging farmers to leave an area or even to build an area along water or waterways. There's not a whole lot of money. We do have a couple of places where we've got them to fence cattle away from creeks. I know that what Mr. Overholt was talking about, and it's not just Renfrew and Lanark, it's happening all over the place because land is more valuable and farmers are trying to get every little bit out of it that they can. They're removing fences and bush areas. So yeah, what our goal has been to talk to farmers. There has been tree planting going on along waterways, trying to get people to stay a little farther away from waterways if they're cropping, especially. I know up here there's been a fencing cattle out for a long time now. It's still bothersome to me to see cattle walking through a creek. And I used to be a dairy farmer, so that's an ongoing battle, and I think we have to maybe see if we can get more money to get farmers or whoever just to stay away from the waterways a bit.
Great, thank you for sharing. And yes, we're always looking to move our natural edge program in different areas too, and to try and create different resources for people and, you know, connecting with local community groups. So it does sometimes come down to funding and people power, but if anyone has any questions about that specific region, they're more than welcome to reach out to us. But I do notice that we are at the 2 o'clock mark. So again, I thank everyone for sticking with us the full hour and wish you a good rest of your day.